Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our third of our Make Your Mark series of webinars. Today we'll be talking about the regenerative economy. My name's Kendall. I'm the Customer Engagement Manager at the Planet Mark. I'm sure many of you know, but for those of you who might not, the Planet Mark is a sustainability certification. So we have a unique three-step process, and we always focus on getting the best out of people, technology and nature. As I mentioned, today in our webinar we'll be focusing on the regenerative economy, and we're delighted to be joined by our guest speakers. So today that is Brian O'Callaghan from the University of Oxford, Nicki Whittaker from Prologis, and our very own CEO Steve Malkin. So I'm going to ask them now, perhaps in that order, to turn on their cameras, and if they can all give us a hello and a bit of an introduction, so you can all get familiar with our faces and see who we are and who's on the webinar today. So Brian, maybe if we start with you, if you could turn on your camera and give us a hello, that would be wonderful.
Hi everyone, great to meet you this morning. I'm dialing in from Oxford. This place has become an absolute ghost town without all the students and the tourists, but I think it's how it's meant to be enjoyed. I'm originally an Australian, but I'm in Oxford at the moment conducting research with the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment in renewable energy finance, and more recently on macroeconomic response to the COVID-19 crisis and how we might green that response. So looking forward to discussions with you today.
Thanks so much, Brian. And Nicki?
Hello everyone, thanks for joining. I'd like to say I was here in sunny Stratford-upon-Avon. Sadly, it's not so sunny today. I work for Prologis UK. I will explain a little bit more about what we do when I speak, but I head up the marketing and communications function. I also sit on the exec team, and I have a responsibility for our community engagement. I work very closely with our UK head of sustainability, and I'm really passionate about sustainable leadership, and I'm really looking forward to today's webinar.
Thank you, Nicki. And then finally, Steve.
Morning everyone. Hi, I'm Steve Malkin, founder of the Planet Mark. I'm also looking forward to today's webinar because perhaps we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that is presented to us to reset our trajectory to tackle climate change, tackle biodiversity loss, and show how we really can contribute to society. And from a sort of typical Planet Mark style, we'll be looking at this, I think, from a perspective of definitely the individuals, but also of the organisation. So I hope that from today we're going to learn about what the regenerative economy is. Get ready, Brian, if you don't mind, and then get into, well, what's our role to play within that, which is where we hope Nicki can come in, and we'll have a really good discussion about it. So yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And before we jump into all that really exciting content, just a few things from us on housekeeping. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see several icons. So you'll have joined, mute and no video. That's all good. There's in that row of icons at the bottom, there will be a Q&A function. So if you have any questions, please stick those in the Q&A box under that icon, and that allows us to see which questions are most important, which are coming up a lot during the webinar, and you should be able to upvote. So if you see other people asking questions that you would also like answered, if you upvote on that questions, we can see which are the most popular questions throughout the session. And there's also a chat function which you can please feel free to chat in, say hello in, but any questions, please do stick them in the Q&A box. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand back to Steve now, who's going to talk us through the agenda and start us off.
Kendall, thanks ever so much. Firstly, we had an apology this morning from Dr. Mari Mackay, who was going to be joining our session, but was slightly unwell this morning. I think it might be a food poisoning thing. So we send our best wishes to Mari. I know she's going to be listening in on the recording that we will have of this session. but our other speakers are going to ably fill in, I know, because there's an awful lot to talk about on this particular subject. So there's going to be a little bit of scene setting from me, and then we'll get into the meat of the agenda, as it were. So we're going to run for around about sort of 30 or 40 minutes of talking, and then there'll be the Q&A at the end. But please keep firing these questions in, because what we do know is that this is sort of a discussion, and there will be takeaways for us all here, but in particular for you. We'd like you to go away armed with information and passion for this really, really important moment in time. And critically, there will be questions I think that you might want to ask about, okay, I hear what you're saying, but what does it mean to me? And what do I do about it? Here I am in an organization, and as an individual, what are the best things I can do right now and for the next few months to really boost the regenerative economy? So to that end, I wonder if you could just kind of move this next slide forward. As you know, at the Planet Mark, we talk a great deal about the sort of triple bottom line, about the sort of the enormous value to not only organizations but to society and the environment, by considering your economic, your environmental and your social impacts all together, all in one. And this is something the OECD has really sort of picked up and is critical at this moment in time, which is about looking beyond growth. We know that we are going to be going into a recession. It may be a deep and long-lasting recession, and we also know that there is going to be a lot of stimulus, a lot of support, a lot of money being pumped into economies around the world to, you might have heard the phrase, build back better. And this is our moment where we can do that, and I think this is the space that we'll be touching on firstly with Brian around the regenerative economy. But what the OECD said is that, listen, OECD have said is, we need to be looking at society and the environment and the economy all in one. This is typical triple bottom line sustainability stuff. And as they say here, look, if we're going to paraphrase it, it's about people and planet. And this is very important right now. Kendall, if you can just go to the next slide, because we've also been talking about the decade of action, this sort of really powerful phrase, created by the UN and in and around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is about the importance of this 10-year period that we are now embarking upon, or into now, 2020 to 2030, where at the very least we need to be tackling once and for all the climate crisis, halving our carbon emissions over that period, but also tackling sort of chronic biodiversity loss within that period, and the sort of mass extinction that we're experiencing right now. So this connectivity between people, technology and nature become very, very important. And perhaps through this recession and the stimulus that will be, that will drive us through that recession out the other side, perhaps that could be geared towards the sort of the green economy or the regenerative economy. And maybe that's our way of resetting our trajectory towards, zero carbon living, more sustainable, healthier, happier planet, one where we're working in harmony with nature as opposed to, against nature. Now, that might be our sort of jump off point, I think, for our first sort of speaker. So I wonder if we could somehow, Kendall, sort of bring sort of Brian into view. There you are, Brian, and coming off your mute. We really welcome you today, and we thank you for taking your time out, because you wrote an sort of outstanding report on this sort of moment in time about actually, can fiscal stimulus support us through this recession and tackle climate change. I'm going to leave that with you for your slides in a moment, if you don't mind, and if you can explain to people a bit more about that in that part of your presentation. But I want to cover a couple of things off first, and I don't excuse myself, but I don't always understand things, and so I wonder if you could start with something very basic, which is, what is this definition of what is the regenerative economy? Do you mind letting us know? Not sure, Brian, have you frozen a bit there? Let's see if we can get Brian back online, because that's the question that we might want to sort of kick us off with. Or is it me? Have I frozen? I'm not sure. While we work out the technical part, Brian, you're with us now. Great.
I'm here.
Could you tell us enlighten us, what's the definition of the regenerative economy?
Sure. So regenerative economics was born, I believe, out of some of John Fullerton's work in the early 2010s. And it's similar in many ways to donut economics, which some of you may be more familiar with. That's from Kate Raworth out of Oxford. And the premise is pretty simple. They say that resources are right now constrained in a way that is underappreciated by traditional growth economics. And basically balance is an essential ingredient to our long-term prosperity. So, I mean, in short, and the name donut economics really speaks to it, we should be seeing resource usage as circular as opposed to linear. And if we are to reorient our perspective on economics in that way, we'll end up with a more sustainable economy in the long term, and in fact, maximize growth over the long term too. I mean, if Marie were here, she would possibly be telling you that cooperation is the way that we'll get out of COVID-19 crisis, as opposed to focusing internally. And she'd probably define wealth to include perspectives on human and natural capital, in addition to financial capital. And we would say that focusing on more than just the financial aspects will help our recovery to be a more positive one for society and for the environment too in the long term. So that's a bare bones approach to regenerative economics.
Thanks ever so much. And could I just ask, just to keep going on that one a little bit, because when we talk to organizations about sustainability, we use the sort of the classic Venn diagram of, balancing your economic, social and environmental impacts. Is that still, we're still looking at that balance? Is that still the right sort of way to be approaching and thinking about this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the approach that we take too, both in our conversations with businesses and helping businesses to approach their corporate operations and really set their internal aims, but also in the conversations that we have with government policy, even for something which has traditionally been seen as 100% growth oriented, which is fiscal stimulus, needs to incorporate perspectives that relate to the environment and relate to social outcomes too. So absolutely, that's the correct articulation.
And we were sort of talking about the business value that is sort of generated by considering it that way. And we are sort of aware, and many organizations that we work with are aware of the business value. Do you think, though, that through this sort of recession, that sort of sustainability, triple bottom line thinking with organizations will help them through the recovery? Is that the sort of the basic sort of tenet here around the regenerative economy?
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think that this stage of the economic cycle changes that. In some ways, it probably emphasizes it, actually. And that's going to be particularly the case if you have government responses which are green and focusing on a triple bottom line too. If we can align each of these different actors to that single narrative, it's going to be positive outcomes for all.
And you touched on something which is, we talk about a lot, but sometimes quite difficult to achieve, which is collaboration. Yeah, so we're kind of used to sort of the economic sort of way of competing, organizations competing against each other. This is the period where we look like we're going to be sort of dropping some of those barriers and finding ways to collaborate, to consider sort of circular thinking in terms of how we engage with supply chains and customers to get materials back into play, for instance, in making products and so on. That's also a fundamental part of the regenerative economy, would you say?
Yeah, collaboration is an important part, but I would differentiate collaboration for positive social and environmental outcomes versus free market competition. And I think that you can be a proponent of each simultaneously, and you don't have to give up free market competition in order to align your different initiatives with peers who are also looking for positive environmental and social outcomes. In some ways that can actually lead to greater a greater competition on the economic side.
That's interesting, actually, because I think that's something that Nicki might be picking up on from a Prologis perspective about why they are sort of so focused around sort of environmental and social governance and so on. From a broader sort of global perspective, what's happening right now, and what are we seeing around the world in terms of why this is an important moment in time, to invest in the economy? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I mean, we have both the economic conversation and the environmental or climate conversation. On the environmental climate side, we were at a point at which there's significant and growing enthusiasm for action on the climate, at least here in the UK. On the economic side, you had economies in many parts of the world doing reasonably well. Obviously, the COVID-19 crisis has fundamentally changed both of those different pathways. So our general explanation is that we've seen very big economic consequences as a result of prolonged mobility restrictions, like the lockdowns themselves. And the consequences of that was quite clear very early on. Back in mid-March, we as in researchers that I've been collaborating with on the work here were quite cognizant that the economic downturn would lead to a moment requiring significant government stimulus, fiscal stimulus. Amidst all of the terror and the immense suffering that COVID has brought, we saw that government spending as a possible turning point for the economic system, to take us from the status quo where growth is based on how much fossil fuel we use to one where growth is decoupled from fossil fuels completely. And the climate conversation in recent months has focused on two aspects. One, a downtick in greenhouse gas emissions due to the lockdown associated with, again, the mobility restrictions. But the fact that if we are to meet some of the Paris obligations that we have, we'd need to continue to replicate those types of, or those levels of slowdown year on year on year on year to 2050. And as a result, that maybe lifestyle changes aren't the only way for us to get there, and maybe completely turning daily life on its head isn't going to be the most effective way to get there. There's also a need for that government spending to change things at a systematic level as opposed to just at the lifestyle level. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but those are the conversations that I'll take you through in the recent work that we've been putting together.
And before we do go, I would like to hand now over to you into your deck, because I think we're getting into that sort of frame. But I think there's just one sort of question that I would like to ask, if you don't mind, which is about, look, quite often, this decoupling of sort of economic sort of value and carbon is very, very important. And coming from the Planet Mark perspective, we see around us organisations flourishing by embracing sustainability. But is that a commonly held view? Is there, is it truly understood that actually we can decouple carbon from our, economic recovery, and we can get the best for society and the environment and the economy all in one? Is that really understood right now within this sort of framework of the regenerative economy with, countries and companies around the world?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that's pretty much exactly what we look to approach with our recent study. I would say, though, that our approach was actually to take a step back from the regenerative or donut economy perspective and to address that question. Can you have policy and business with positive economic and climate outcomes with the traditional growth model? We wanted to, as opposed to preach to the converted who believe in this regenerative economy approach, we wanted to preach to the masses and see whether just fundamentally can government policy bring positive economic outcomes whilst bringing positive climate outcomes too. Yeah, Would you like me to jump into the presentation now, Steve?
I think that's a really great segue. Yes, it is. And thanks ever so much, Brian. And we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. Well, perhaps before I get into it, a little bit further introduction to me and my background. I did mention that I'm here at the University of Oxford looking at these green recovery perspectives. What I didn't mention was my broader background. So I'm actually here at Oxford while taking some time off from the Boston Consulting Group, where I work as part of the core energy team. I'm also aligned with the Robertson Foundation, who are a philanthropic group based out of New York, and I advise on environmental and energy-related investment topics. And so the research that I'm doing here at Oxford relate to each of those different points in my background. As I mentioned, I cover energy finance, but more broadly, I look to macroeconomic topics too. And that's where all of this work comes together. So while much of our work at the Smith School is in agreement with this new regenerative view of the economic system, the work that I'm presenting today is really a demonstration of how a green recovery makes sense, even with a traditional growth lens. In other words, as I said before, we're preaching to the masses and not necessarily just to the converted. So to address this fundamental concern that maybe you lose out on in economic terms when you invest in climate-related activities, I got together with some of the heavyweights in economics, namely Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel laureate out of Columbia University, Nicholas Stern, based in the UK, former chief economist of the World Bank, and then Cameron Hepburn and another Cambridge professor who are quite active in this space too. So we investigated, firstly, past spending measures, how past government spending has done on climate outcomes and economic outcomes in times of economic emergency, and also ran a global survey, all to answer the question, how could COVID-19 fiscal recovery packages accelerate or otherwise retard progress on climate change? And the paper itself has subsequently been published in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which you can check out online. It's one of the more prestigious peer-reviewed journals in the field. Perhaps we can move on to the next slide. So the money slide from our paper was this one. It's a diagram that's now been reprinted and discussed everywhere, from the Times to the New York Times to Forbes and so on. Even Prince Charles and Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum have seen it and commented on it. What it's showing is a set of recovery type policies that governments may be considering as a part of their fiscal stimulus plans right about now. So each of those bubbles is one of those recovery type policies, or archetypes as we call them. And the graph itself is showing how those policies were perceived to perform against a climate impact metric on the y-axis and against an economic impact metric on the x-axis, namely the long-term or the long-run multiplier, growth multiplier of those policies. In short, what how much value each policy delivers to the economy for every dollar that's spent. And so we asked a set of over 230 leading economists to rate each of these policies against those metrics. And these leading experts were really the most elite in their field. So we're talking finance ministers, central bank governors, some of the most highly cited academics, leaders of development banks too. So that was the respondent group. And then the green box in the top right quartile, that's our Goldilocks zone, or maybe we should call it our Greenielocks zone, I suppose. It's the policies that bring high economic impact and high climate impact too. I've bolded or tried to circle in a thicker line the policies that you traditionally consider as green. So you can see how well they tend to do on economic multipliers too. Maybe I can direct your attention in particular to policy T, which is clean infrastructure investment. That's broad, but it includes things like solar panels, transmission infrastructure, utility scale batteries. Also, policy Y does very well on both metrics. That's our clean research and development spending. It surprised us actually that the overall desirability of that policy performed so well, because even in a time of in a time of economic recession, you need things that are quite fast acting, and obviously R&D isn't all that fast acting. We also had policy S, that's connectivity infrastructure like public transport and broadband initiatives, one of the most highly performing on the long run multiplier, and obviously it's also good for the climate. And then probably the final note is poor little policy E in the bottom left corner there, unconditional airline bailouts, which performed the most negatively on every metric. So we cut this data every which way you can imagine, thinking, for example, about how ideal policies might differ in low and middle income countries or in Europe versus the States, and also finance ministers versus central bankers, for example. We found the trends are consistent throughout. Whilst there's a little bit greater variation, the gaps between policies might be bigger or smaller across different respondent groups, the overall trends are pretty consistent, which gives a pretty strong message. And that message is obviously, actually, yes, you can have policy that does well for the economy and for the environment. Yeah, thanks for the next slide. Perfect. So through our work, and I should know that work also included a number of pieces in addition to the survey. There are quite a bit of research looking back at past policy items. But through that work, we developed 3 policy recommendations, and this is what I've been presenting to policymakers, politicians, ministers, etc., from governments around the world over the last few weeks, and what gets them excited too. So first, we identify these 5 recovery policy archetypes. I won't go through them in detail, but these are the ones that we recommend above others at the global level. Obviously, there's domestic level intricacies which might change what the top policy items are, and there's a little bit of that for the UK too. Second, we also note, and this is important on the social side, that there's a potential to gain significant additional non-economic, non-climate co-benefits with these policies and the spending. So for example, here in the UK, low income households are far more likely to avoid turning on their heaters during the winter due to high electricity prices. And that results in pretty poor health outcomes and perpetuates the class divide, etc. So perhaps if a government pursued a home insulation program as a form of energy efficiency, that could be targeted to those who are from low income households. And so you'd be winning on the economy, winning on the climate, and winning on inequality too. So our final policy recommendation, I'm not going to go through the detail because most of you aren't policymakers, but really the devil is in the detail, and there's a lot we can learn from the past. Moving on, very briefly, one of the common questions is, well, where is all of this money going to come from? To be honest, that's not the hard part for most high income countries like the UK. It's going to come from new government borrowing in the form of treasury notes or government bonds sold to yourselves and your institutional peers who seem to have an insatiable appetite for these things. And then it's also going to be from continued quantitative easing. My position here and through the study isn't necessarily to encourage spending, though. It's more to state that if we are going to be spending in a big way, we should be spending it on items that set up future business and industry while also protecting our climate. And to move on to the next slide, and I'm not going to spend too long here either, but it gives you the gist of what has been going on internationally. What you need to know is that rhetoric is quite strong in a number of countries, rhetoric for a green recovery, and it's quite strong here in the UK too. But we've all seen enough new moons to know that rhetoric is empty until proven with action. And so we find ourselves in one of these crazy, most pivotal moments in history in the climate change narrative. Will business and the public stand up to guide policymakers towards a sustainable future, or will we be silent? The European Commission released their new recovery plan last week, which you may have seen in the news. It was quite highly reported. And that's just another example, to be honest. It's fantastic rhetoric, but when you read into the details, you see that very little is written in stone, very little is there to require any particular line of action. And so it's ultimately going to come up to society, the public and business to guide those conversations and hold policymakers accountable to that rhetoric. Which brings us to the final slide in this presentation, which is the one that I would be asking in your shoes. How can I, as a business leader, help guide my business in accelerating this green recovery? Is this, one of those times where we can lean back in our chairs and rejoice that we didn't take the public sector route, so we don't have to make those decisions? And our response is no. It's quite literally the opposite. There's no break for us on the business side, and perhaps this is the most vocal time, the most vital time for us to be vocal. We're all actors within the economy, and being complicit here is akin to being antagonistic against the green recovery narrative. So we don't really have the option of passing without comment this time around. So 3 quick and easy recommendations that I might leave you with for how you may begin to take action. And really they are the small things that seem to accumulate. So firstly, pressure. I like to say that every extra breath brings the balloon that much closer to popping. And it might take 50 or 100 breaths, but you get there in the end. And we do find that those small and easy things can be quite impactful, or they have an outsized effect at least. So for example, simple social media statements in support of a clean recovery, or sharing the work of leaders in the space, or just an extra paragraph in your next market update framing your positions of support. There have been a number of business leader petitions going around too, and those have got significant press. So each of those types of small actions do have impact. The second encouragement I'd have for you is to think practically for your own business about how a green recovery may benefit you. How may it prompt you to consider new green investment and ready your businesses for new growth? A lot of this spending is going to be in the form of subsidies or direct partnerships agreements for businesses like your own who are seeking to spend in a sustainable way. If you can articulate those perspectives internally and then share them directly with government, the lobbying effort is really, really strengthened. And finally, as the clock runs down, you're all leaders in your own right with your own set of networks that extend on a personal level. And there's an easy opportunity to simply begin having more conversations on this topic. I think we all know from experience how many transformational decisions, they used to emerge around the office kettle, and now they're more through online chat. But each of those small conversations can set off a ricochet and help to bring larger scale change. Now, that's it from me, and I look forward to any of your later questions. I'm sure I've missed a lot, but I might hand back over to Steve at this point.
Ryan, thanks ever so much. I've got a few questions myself, but we're going to hold those for the end because we'd love to hear from Nicki in a moment. But love some of the takeaways, and I love the greenie lock zone. We like that. I don't know if that's a term, but it might be from now. And this big piece about leadership, leadership and lobbying, using our voice, and our actions to lead by example. And I want to come back on those points, but I think that's also our ideal way to handing over to Nicki because here's an example about how an organization has led by example over the past decade and into this new decade. This is a really exciting story. I'm going to hand over to Nicki to tell it. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Right, so before we start, I'm going to be good. I'm going to start my stopwatch, so hopefully I won't run over. Thank you very much. I just want to cover three things really in my presentation. The first is the role of business in recovery. The second is to look at what Prologis has done over the past, actually 12 years now, in terms of sustainability and our work with the Planet Mark and Cool Earth. And then I just want to look at some key takeaways and in terms of how we can be more sustainable as leaders and encourage people within our organisations to help us build back better. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So I wanted to start here because I think this is really important. Not only is this one of my favourite proverbs, I think there's literal and metaphorical meaning here. And in terms of how businesses can actually help us build back better, I think this really encompasses how we can do that. So first of all, without doubt, and I'll go on to talk about how we're doing this, planting trees is absolutely the smartest and most effective thing we can do to tackle climate change. But there's also something else really deep here in terms of doing small things repetitively that make meaningful change. And as Brian said, it's the small things that count, and that's really where we need to start. I don't know how many of you have read The Man Who Planted Trees. If you have, you'll know it's an allegorical tale about a shepherd who spends 4 decades reforesting a valley with predominantly acorns, and the value that that brings to, in terms of biodiversity, the local community, jobs, and then that forest being protected. So, and this is all because of small repetitive actions based on a desire to do the right thing and bring about meaningful change, and that's really at the heart of our sustainable development program at Prologis. And you know, we as businesses, you know, we can't wait for government to legislate for change. We have to be the change, and we have to empower people within our organizations to help us make that change. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with Prologis as a business, we build logistics warehouses, and these logistics warehouses sit on logistics parks that we own and manage. So for anyone who's taken a trip up the motorway through Northamptonshire, or certainly as you go down towards Devon and Cornwall on the M5, you will notice these large buildings by the side of the motorway, and these are predominantly used by the likes of Tesco, Amazon, Sainsbury's, John Lewis. And within these buildings, you'll have goods that are going to supermarkets. You'll also have goods that are stored until you click on something on Amazon, for example. They'll be picked and packed in a warehouse, and then they will be sent to your house. So the recent crisis has done a couple of things. First of all, I think for me, in terms of sustainable leadership, it's really recalibrated the relationship between business and society. And the other thing it's done is increased online shopping. In April, for example, compared with the previous month, spending on online sales rose by 18% compared with the previous month. And that sent the proportion spent online to the highest on record at 30.7%. And in the SARS outbreak of 2003, really online shopping started to gain momentum then. It will increase again. Takes 33 days to form a habit. People have become used to shopping online. Why does this matter? Well, as online shopping increases, we, as the providers of warehouses, will have to build more warehouses closer to where people live and work, so that these goods can get to people in the time frame they want them. So 12 years ago, a few people within the Prologis UK business were looking at the carbon expended in building these warehouses, and there are two types of carbon emissions. There's the embodied carbon, which is the carbon that is expended during the construction process, and then there's the operational carbon. So these are things that happen within the life of the building. And operational carbon, we can reduce that by good building design, better ventilation, air tightness, better heating. Embodied carbon is more difficult, so this happens within year zero, within the construction process. And while there are some things we can do in terms of material, we can't avoid it entirely. So there was no compunction, there was no legislation that said we had to do anything about this, but as a business, we very much felt it was the right thing to do. And 12 years ago, we partnered with the Planet Mark, and what we wanted to do was we wanted sort of robust science-based targets, which really helped us to measure both our impact and how we were reducing that impact. You know, there's an old saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. So being able to measure that enabled us to see how well we were doing going forward. So we now have a decade of information. So the Planet Mark help us carry out robust carbon life cycle assessments on all our new buildings in the UK, but we felt like we wanted to do more. We wanted to go above those assessments, and we wanted to really tackle this thorny issue of embodied carbon. And you know, environmental legislation, whilst it looks at operational carbon, it doesn't really tackle embodied carbon. So we wanted to do that. And the Planet Mark introduced us to a fantastic charity called Cool Earth, and they're a rainforest protection charity, and they work with rainforest communities to protect areas of rainforest. And they do this to obviously to help the communities make money managing their forests, so they can be resilient, they can have better healthcare, education. But these areas of rainforest produce barriers to stop the loggers coming through and chopping down areas of rainforest. So we started to work with Cool Earth, thanks to the introduction from the Planet Mark. And not only do we now have carbon life cycle assessments for our new buildings, but each new building for the past 12 years has protected an area of rainforest 5 times greater than its embodied carbon footprint. And two questions people ask. First of all, they say, why rainforest? Rainforest is remote, it's far away, you know, why not do something local? Rainforest, as I said before, protecting trees, protecting rainforest is the smartest move we can make in terms of trying to halt climate change, because rainforest, you know, is this massive sort of carbon sponge. It takes up carbon, and it also protects wildlife, insect species. It protects biodiversity. 1/5 of the world's fresh water is actually comes from the rainforest, so there's a huge benefit to protecting rainforest. And in terms of protecting 5 times the area, you know, being realistic, we would like to think that we could stop the loggers moving in and taking down great swathes of rainforest, but in reality, what you often do is you displace it, so the loggers go elsewhere. By protecting 5 times the embodied carbon footprint, we not only maintain a robust approach, but we can ensure we're achieving a net good, because we know that the loggers can never undo that 5-time multiplier. So that's really, really important. We don't have a massive amount of time to sort of dig deep into our sustainable development program today, but please link with me on LinkedIn, email me if you have any questions. I would love to open a dialogue with you and explain exactly what we do and the technical data behind all of this and how our approach was put together. So over the 12 years, if we go on to the next slide, I'll just look at what benefit that has actually brought. So this 12-year programme, as you can see, has really allowed us to make an enormous difference. And the other thing that I didn't mention, which is the third part of what we do, is in addition to measuring and reducing carbon, in addition to protecting rainforests to mitigate the embodied carbon, we also work with local schools and colleges close to our development, because we are passionate about making sure that the next generation can actually understand how they play their part in protecting the planet. So, you know, there are quite a lot of figures there to take in. I think one of the most important ones, there's the 12,500 acres of rainforest. And if you're wondering what 12,500 acres of rainforest looks like, if we go on to the next slide, that's actually almost an area almost the size of Luxembourg City. It's also 36 times greater than Hyde Park in central London. And if we go on to the last slides, I know I've only got a few minutes left. If I could, from a sustainable leadership point of view, if there are three things I would say take away: be the difference, innovate. 12 years ago in our business, two people came up with an idea. We didn't have to do what we'd done. We did it because we thought it was the right thing to do. The business backed them. Allow your people to innovate, help them be leaders in their own sphere of influence. If you've got someone within your business who's passionate about reducing plastic use within the business, or has a great idea of how you can become more sustainable, back them to follow that passion, because small things like that can become big changes, as you see. Collaborate. Brian talked about this, really, really important. If we're going to solve, you know, what we call in business a wicked problem, and climate change is a wicked problem, we need to collaborate. Sometimes that may mean working with competitors, other times it's working with groups outside your organisation, really bringing in diverse viewpoints. And the third thing, which is a big one for me, which is communicate. So tell other people what you're doing, tell other people who you're working with, share that information, and let's, as businesses, help to build back better, and really let's drive government, let's drive change, and let's be that difference. Thank you. I hope I've kept to time.
Thank you so much, Nicki. You're absolutely spot on. Amazing last takeaways to finish on as well. Thank you so much. We actually have time for some questions and answers now as well, so hopefully we can go into some more detail as well. Thanks so much for everyone for submitting all your questions in the Q&A box. It's really helpful, and all the upvoting, really, really great. Thank you. So I suppose at this point we'll bring back in Steve, Brian and Nicki for the Q&A, and we will put some questions to you from the audience. So in terms of the most popular question that we've had in our list, which has had 5 votes, for someone who doesn't have any experience of applying for grants or innovation funds, what recommendations do you have to make businesses better prepared? So Nicki, Steve and Brian, I think this one probably came through for Brian, but anyone feel free to jump in.
My experience in the UK on this front is quite limited. So Nicki, it might be better suited to you and your experiences.
So I would think if when I don't know where to start with something, I find someone who can help me. I think that would be my advice. There are lots of times where, as a leader within an organisation, I don't have all the answers, and that's where I would ask people, use your networks, use this network. I'm sure lots of people within this network will be able to help each other find those sources and actually solve some of these problems. So let's connect offline, let's form a group, and let's help each other solve some of these problems. But I would say build a network and find someone who can help you.
Amazing.
If I were to add to that, I think that maybe it's not a strong point of mine. It's a weakness, but we'll create a space and a community to answer that question, and we'll come back to you with places, suggestions on how we do it through business networks and the network that we've got. So we will take that away and we'll help solve that one.
Thanks both. And then from Sarah Valley, also lots of votes on this question as well. Surely the big money is going to the traditional corporates and business as usual. As a green leading company, how should I use my voice and marketing to support the regenerative economy?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. And Nicki, I'm sure you'll be able to augment again. But you're absolutely right. In many economies, and even here in the UK, we're probably going to see more than the majority of funds go to support incumbents and to support the status quo. So I do feel for green businesses amongst those in the audience. In terms of how to best use your voice, I mean, you have a platform amongst the converted, let's say, but those converted do also have their own networks which extend quite broadly beyond just the climate positive sphere. And so I think using the platform that you already have and I'm guessing the passionate base of consumers who you serve to further the narrative itself and to encourage greater lobbying efforts too. So I think just using the voice and the platform that you have, being vocal and leveraging the existing Planet Mark set of resources here too. But Nicki, you can provide practical advice, I'm sure.
So I think it's really interesting. We talked about the I can't even say it, the regenerative economy. Something that's a bit easier to say and kind of goes hand in hand with that is actually what I would call the passion economy. And I think actually we have an opportunity here to use our passion for sustainability to really talk about the subject. So as Brian said, use your platforms, build your sphere of influence, collaborate, find like-minded people, get involved with webinars, just put yourself out there. And if you're passionate, people will join with you, people will get behind you. And we've seen some of the smallest, most disruptive innovators have become some of the biggest voices. So you can be a big voice in the room. We start small and build.
Thank you, Nicki and Brian. We've actually got loads of questions, so we will have to follow up afterwards, I think, on some of these. But from Claire Fernell Williams, lots of votes on this one too. Can I ask the panel's view on the new Clean Growth Fund that was recently launched by the government? I'm going to leave you to jump in.
So do you have any comments on that one, Brian? Or is this one that we might need to respond? We'll come back to you, Claire, on. I'm not sure if you have, that might have been one from Murray, but Brian, do you have any views?
Yeah, so I'm not extremely familiar with the fund itself. I believe that it's supporting early stage ventures in clean tech. And so if that is correct, I can speak to that more broadly and to say that that type of investment is essential. It's a public form of catalytic capital, which is helping to accelerate the development of technologies or clean technologies, which will shape future industry. And so the initiative itself then is a positive one. And there are mirrors all around the world and in the EU's new Green Recovery Plan too, which support it. Generally speaking, we find that those types of investments can have one of the highest, or just research and development generally can have one of the highest long-term returns in terms of economic multiplier, and so really good in the long term for an economy. The more specific question as to whether it's appropriate right now for a recovery where you need significant boost in the short term, the immediate term, is a little bit more complicated. My view is that there is still a role for clean R&D in a recovery package, but you need to remember that it's a part of a broader package, right? So that might be some of the longer acting policy items that sort of sit on the right side of that spectrum, but it does need to be paired with some of the more short-term acting policies. So in the very immediate future, that can be direct cash support, but should also be supplemented by shovel-ready projects that are ready to go, like your green retrofits, etc., which have been quite popular over the years. And then in the middle space, it might be our medium to long-term clean infrastructure investments, new broadband infrastructure, new transmission network infrastructure, and then that clean R&D space takes the longer-term multiplier.
Thanks, Brian. And as Steve mentioned, maybe we could pick up on that as well afterwards in the follow-up email if anyone has anything else they wanted to add. And then final question, I think we might have time for. So from Chloe Longform, a lot of money is going into the UK economy, hopefully fueling the green economy. What are the mechanisms to get funding for organisations? Maybe this is one, I don't know if someone wants to pick up, or we could follow up afterwards in the follow-up email.
So in terms of direct mechanisms, many of those are still unclear because the packages themselves haven't been established. I think it's just going to be a matter of time before we see which way the UK government and BEIS decides to take this. What we can say is that the actions of business now can help to direct that spending in a very meaningful way. And we've spoken a lot about using the existing platforms that we have. Using those productively can help to set aside these pools of capital for you to use through the recovery process. But as of right now, most of those recovery funds haven't been established. So the mechanisms themselves will remain unclear for a little while.
Thanks, Brian. We have actually loads and loads of questions, so I don't think we'll have time to answer all of them, but maybe we could follow up in the email and get you some answers, because there's loads of great questions in here. We don't want to miss out on them. So thank you so much, everyone who sent those through. They're all great. I think I'm going to take this moment to hand back to Steve, who's going to give us a little bit of a summary before we close the session. Thanks so much, Nicki and Brian, as well, for your responses. Super interesting. Thanks.
Kendall, thanks ever so much. And thanks to Brian and Nicki. Really appreciate it. Just a couple of quick takeaways. There are a lot of questions here that we will answer. We're going to come back to you with a Q&A. But there's some next steps in a moment. I've got 3 takeaways. I think at least this is a critical moment in time. I think we all identify, that is the case. And that we have this opportunity to build back better, to have a high positive economic impact, as Brian said, and a high climate positive impact as well. And that's that sort of zone, which is the greeny zone, which I really liked. I don't know, really cottoned onto that. So we have this moment where we can do something extraordinary. The way we might do that is to communicate, and this is a big piece around using everything we can to provide pressure, to look at how we're spending as organizations and individuals, and also utilizing our own personal networks as companies. And that sort of leadership and lobbying that we can apply right now through our individual actions and and communicating into our networks. And the final one was about engaging and innovating. We've heard much of this from Nicki. Don't wait for government to legislate. Money will be available. We will come back to you with a toolkit, which will, particularly Claire's question I really liked. So how might, is this a good, fund, and how might we access it? I think that we have a role to play in helping you with that. But, that measurement, the work that you can do about looking at your own impact, how you might engage and how you might innovate, through this recession, so we get positive impacts for society and the environment. This very much is our sort of moment in time. So those were my takeaways. The last little bit, so just some next steps, Kendall, if we can just perhaps take a look at that. We're going to share the slide deck. We've had a recording here. We'll share that with you. There will be a follow-up blog from us and our speakers, we hope. Please do start to use your voice. We're here on the Planet, on the number 4 is there, comment on our Twitter post at the Planet Mark. Any further questions, go straight to Ashley on email. and or on our website. This is the start of an ongoing conversation and an ongoing set of action. And maybe there's something in around the regenerative economy and the passion economy, which I also really liked. Just final thank you to our speakers as well. We really appreciate your time this morning. It's been really valuable and lots of thinking to do. Ken.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, echo that thank you. And just really, really great to see so many of you attend the webinar today. Thank you. And thanks for getting involved. For our next webinar, we'll be talking about the invisible emitter and how to reduce your digital footprint. That's going to take place on the 17th of June, and we'll be doing it in collaboration with experts from Digital Detox. So we look forward to hopefully seeing most of you in a fortnight as well. And thanks again for joining. We hope to see you soon.